Hello, welcome back to my channel. Today I will be doing part 1 of my February wrap-up, the first 6 books I read in the month of February. The books I read cover, at least in this round, cover ground of nonfiction, since it was Black History Month, historical fiction with magical realism elements, a Korean translation about vampires, social media hell, and very dark humor about Western NGOs and ISIS brides. So, if any of that sounds interesting to you, stick around and we will get started. The first book I finished in the month of February was 1,000 Times Before by Asha Thanki. I got this in a little lending library, and it is a multi-generational historical fiction book that follows 3 different generations of women. It starts out in the present with the main character, the granddaughter of this historical family, named, I'm going to butcher these names, I am so sorry, Ayukta. She is a lesbian Indian American woman living in Brooklyn in her 30s, and she and her wife are thinking about having a child. And so she has to reveal to her partner a secret that the maternal line in her family all have access to each other's memories connected via this magical tapestry. And once you sew on someone's portrait onto this tapestry, like their outline, that new person who sewed on has access to seeing into the future and also being able to will events into being via their artwork. Sounds a little convoluted, and I honestly was not quite sure if I understood enough of this connection between the tapestry and artwork and this sort of like all-foreseeing magical powers that happen. But anyway, this is a gift that Ayukta, the narrator, warns her wife that if they have a daughter, that this daughter will inherit for better or for worse. And so we go back into the past. We follow the story of Ayukta's grandmother, Arnie, as she is a young woman during the partition of India and Pakistan, and she flees Karachi, Pakistan, into Gujarat, the Gujarat state of India. And then we follow the next generation, which is Arnie, so the narrator's mother, who is coming of age in the 1970s in India during this tumultuous time, with like all of these student demonstrations and strikes and mass repression under Indira Gandhi's government. No relation to the other Gandhi. Then we get eventually back into like the present again, where we're back into like this apartment in Brooklyn where Ayukta is sharing like this big decision with her wife, right? I thought that this was fine. I felt like the first half was very, very slow. It really dragged, and for some reason I just was not, I don't know, I just felt like I was not really connecting to the main character or any of the events that were really happening well. I do think that it got better later on. I considered DNFing this, honestly, multiple times because it just really wasn't grabbing me. And then it did get better in the second half, especially when we get to like all the student strikes and stuff in the 1970s, because it is a period of Indian history. I mean, not that I really know much about Indian history at all, other than like watching one documentary years ago on partition, but it was a period of Indian history that I really did not know much about, and also kind of explained after this sort of like this massive government repression, why then Hindu nationalism begins to take hold, which we obviously can see today, very much so in India. And I also think in general that the book does do a really good job of illustrating why partition was such a traumatic experience, and a loss for the Indian subcontinent beyond just the initial violence and massacres that led to millions fleeing their homes. I have mixed feelings about this. I thought it was fine. Again, I'm glad I stuck with it. There is a sapphic love story that is nestled within this book beyond just Ayukta and her partner. And I was pleasantly surprised by it because I think that it was handled in a way that did not feel trite or corny, as I often find that love stories, regardless of whether they're straight or homosexual, tend to be. But I think in general, what I would have appreciated more beyond just like the slow beginning was maybe like a historical outline of events, as well as a glossary. I'm not sure why books do not publish glossaries anymore with like terminology. Yeah, that would have been really helpful. And the magical realism bit did feel kind of convoluted. But overall, I thought it was fine. It was decent. And I gave it 3 stars. The second book I read was The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. This is a nonfiction book that is split into 2 essays. The first essay is a letter to Baldwin's nephew on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1962. And then the second essay, Down at the Cross, Letter from a Region in My Mind, takes up the bulk of the book. The second essay starts out primarily with James Baldwin ruminating about his youth and his time as a youth pastor in the church and why he chose to leave the church and how he personally feels that religion, namely Christianity, is hypocritical and also can have this sort of anesthetizing effects on people. He then in turn examines the Nation of Islam. He ends up actually in the essay having dinner at Elijah Muhammad's house, mansion, I guess you could say, headquarters. James Baldwin acknowledges why he feels many African Americans are drawn into the ideology of the Nation of Islam, because it is in many ways sort of this inversion of white Christianity, but he ultimately comes to reject it and finds it to be in many ways just as harmful as Christianity can be. And I think what stuck out to me in this essay was just how much of it, unfortunately, was still so relevant to this day. He calls out a lot of people's hypocrisy in the face of just doing absolutely nothing or being complacent. And this is primarily an observation aimed at white people. There are so many themes here that go into American exceptionalism, Cold War politics, decolonization, revolution, and white people's indifference. All of these are themes and points that are touched upon. And I found that, for one thing, I can see how Ta-Nehisi Coates was definitely inspired by Baldwin. I think in the way that both writers structure their sentences is very similar. So it's not just simply in the subject matter that they write about. There are so many just poignant quotes in this book, and so I had to, honestly, I highlighted just a few. One is about American exceptionalism. The American Negro has the great advantage of having never believed that collection of myths to which white Americans cling, that their ancestors were all freedom-loving heroes, that they were born in the greatest country the world has ever seen, or that Americans are invincible in battle and wise in peace, that Americans have always dealt honorably with Mexicans and Indians and all other neighbors or inferiors, that American men are the world's most direct and virile, and women are pure. A civilization is destroyed not by wicked people. It is not necessary that people be wicked, only that they be spineless. So yes, I think this is a classic book for a reason, and like I said, it is unfortunately, although it does deal with themes that were very, topics and themes that were so prevalent and very much of the time of the mid-20th century, unfortunately a lot of this stuff is still so relevant today, so I would definitely recommend it, and I rated it 4 stars. The next book I read was Julie Chan is Dead by Liann Zhang. This was kind of fluffy and lighthearted, more so than what I typically read, even though some of the stuff that it does, as the book progresses, it is rather dark. But it's fluffy in the sense of that it is sort of this like fun, satirical, over-the-top, escapist thriller that you really have to suspend your disbelief. And I think that this book is very much of the current zeitgeist. So just to give like a very brief summary, This is one of those books where you have an identical twin that ends up taking the place of another identical twin. Chloe is this famous Chinese American influencer. She's really big on social media, and her long lost twin sister, Julie, ends up finding her dead one day as she goes to her apartment. They were separated at birth after their parents were killed in a car accident, and Julie was raised by this very like overbearing, repressive aunt. And so naturally, Julie ends up taking Chloe's place and passing herself off as her. Now, if any of this sounds familiar, it's because it is. I mean, on the one hand, it does remind me a little bit of the talented Mr. Ripley, but it also really gives off Yellowface vibes, as well as this sort of sphere of social media influencers that Julie ends up integrating herself into as Chloe. They're all a part of this like weird cult, these young women. Very much gives off Bunny vibes by Mona Awad. I honestly cannot even remember the name of the cult now. And as the book progresses, and you know, Julie is just living in this lie, they end up taking this weird retreat to this private island. So yes, I would say beyond just the sort of references to Yellowface and Bunny, you also have the Epstein files and White Lotus sprinkled in. And it was honestly weird when I was reading this book because the latest round of Epstein files had just been released. So what a weird timing. Yeah, the writing is just, it's not really the best. Like I said, this is one of those silly, fun, rompy thrillers. And I do think that at the end, the pacing becomes super rushed. You're like, okay, whoa, where did we get here like so quickly? But you know, it was fine. Like it was like an escapist page turner read that you have to keep suspend your disbelief. And you know, sometimes you just need books like that. Sometimes there's only so much you can read about like super heavy, depressing stuff. So it kept me engaged the whole time. What can I say? I would rate it 3.5 stars. I ended up giving it a 3 on Goodreads. The next book I read was Fundamentally by Nussaibah Younis. This was longlisted, or I think shortlisted actually, last year for the Women's Prize in Fiction, and I put off reading it because I felt that given the subject matter and the book's tone that it is a dark comedy, I wasn't quite sure if this was going to really work for me. Sometimes I think there's things that subject matter that dark humor just doesn't really work with. And I was actually pleasantly surprised. I actually did end up enjoying this, believe it or not. So this is about a PhD scholar named Nadia. Nadia is I think she's Pakistani, I'm not sure, British woman from Muslim background, and she goes to Iraq to work for this UN program that was created. She had a hand in helping to create, given her research on rehabilitation and de-radicalization for ISIS brides. And so she goes there, and she's there in this sort of like cordoned off camp. She meets this another British Pakistani girl named Sarah, who is thrice widowed, and she has this really sharp, acerbic sense of humor, and she reminds Nadia so much of herself that saving this girl Sarah and getting her out of the camp and back home essentially kind of becomes saving Nadia. And when trying to get these women out of the camp proves to become this complete bureaucratic nightmare. And we see how not just the bureaucratic ineffectiveness of how all of these different organizations work together, or rather don't work together, but how they are staffed with a lot of very much self-serving people who are there just to like sort of party and have a vacation. When all of that proves to just end up becoming a failure, Nadia decides to take matters into her own hands in order to get Sarah out. So a lot of the humor of this, it's satire aimed at like a couple different things, right? One of the things that I really liked was it's satirizing Western hypocrisy and saviorism and the mess of these international bodies like the UN, like these sort of band-aid solutions of Western NGOs that spring from the same source of Western imperialism as wars and destabilization. And I actually had read, forget her name, who had criticized NGOs saying that they dole out aid what people ought to have as a right, and that they are accountable only to funders and not to citizens, which I think is very much illustrates, as you can see in this book, right? The other aspect that this book does satirize is sort of the politics of religious fundamentalism. The main character, Nadia, is agnostic and queer, and she is the daughter of a very conservative Muslim mother who disowns her for several years, and they don't speak. And I do think probably some conservative Muslims would probably have an issue with this book. It did remind me a little bit of The Occasional Version by Hanan Al-Shaykh, which kind of does the same thing with the same sense of humor. And generally, I am like not really comfortable with that unless like that person, the author themselves, is from a similar background, if you know what I mean. But like not everyone in this book is like either like a fanatic or an apostate, because there are other characters that are portrayed in a much more nuanced way beyond just stereotypes. So overall, I did enjoy this, and I think there are some definitely funny moments. I think some people who rated this negatively missed the point. Like some people I saw online were like, oh, I wish this book would take itself more seriously, talking about the de-radicalization of ISIS brides. That is not the point of the book. That is not just the point. The satire is primarily at this bureaucratic ineffectiveness and hypocrisy of NGOs and the UN, and how they can oftentimes end up becoming in some ways more harmful. And I think all of us have seen within the past 2.5 years the complete collapse of any pretense of international law and this sort of liberal interventionism that is just completely hypocritical and false. And Gaza did that. So yeah, I ended up rating this 4 stars because I thought it was unique and memorable, and I had trouble putting it down. I would definitely recommend it. The next book I read, in keeping with Black History Month, was Assembly by Natasha Brown. This is a novella that follows an unnamed British Jamaican woman who has worked her way up the corporate ladder, working a cushy bank job, and she has a white boyfriend that comes from old money, and over the course of the day she ends up going to some sort of party get together at his parents' estate. And so over the course of the day she ruminates over her place in the world and her family's place and Britain's legacy of slavery, imperialism, colonialism, assimilation, and erasure. And by the end, the narrator comes to this decision to remove herself from the brutal system that she has worked so hard to assimilate into. And I will not elaborate on what remove herself means because I do not want to completely give away spoilers. This book was short, it was succinct. I thought there was a lot of really powerful observations. It was kind of shocking at points, particularly towards like the ending realization that happens. And it is ultimately like a rejection of this sort of like post-racial capitalist meritocracy. I don't know if I fully agree with like the ending conclusion, but I still found the book itself to be compelling nonetheless and kind of shocking. The writing is kind of abstract at times, but I still enjoyed this a lot more than her later work, Universality, which I have reviewed on this channel. I was not a huge fan of that one. I think overall that the observations in this were very astute, and I did have to highlight a couple lines in here. How can we engage, discuss, even think through a post-colonial lens when there's no shared basis of knowledge? When even the simplest account of events, as preserved in the country's own archives, wobbles suspect as tinfoil hat conspiracies in the minds of its educated citizens. I've watched with dispassionate curiosity as this continent hacks away at itself, confused, lost, sick with nostalgia for those imperialist glory days when the them had been so clearly defined. These world superpowers are neither infallible nor superior. They're nothing, not without a brutally enforced relativity. That is very true, not just for Britain, but also the United States. So yeah, I would recommend this, and I rated it 4 stars. And then the last book I will be discussing was a Korean translation called The Midnight Shift by Seon-ran, translated from Korean by Jean Ping. This is a murder mystery with lesbian vampires. I seem to keep reading lesbian vampire books for some reason. But it is, I mean, it's so much more than that. It touches on themes of mortality, loneliness, isolation, ethics. So it is set in contemporary South Korea, and we follow Soo-yeon. I'm going to butcher these Korean names, I'm sorry. She is a detective, and she's working on a case where these nursing home residents have thrown themselves from the tallest point of the nursing home, and all of their bodies are mysteriously drained of blood. And one day, this detective, she's approached by this woman named Violet, who is this self-described vampire hunter. And she believes that vampires are behind this string of nursing home deaths. And then suspicion also then falls to one of the workers there, Nanju, who had changed her name when she previously worked at a different nursing home due to this morphine scandal. So each chapter we alternate between each of the 3 women, and each of these women has had a past or present relationship with some sort of vampire. So vampires are kind of like just a fact of life in this book. I think that the prose was fine. I did feel, though, like I could kind of tell that it was a translation, because even sometimes when like the sentences themselves are fine, in some translations it's like there is a slight aspect you can get the sense that something is just missing. And there were times I actually did have to, like, there was a vagueness that did make me go back and have to reread like a couple pages previously. And I think this has to do with just like when a translation, the original language is so different from English. I feel like this tends to happen because I've had the same issue sometimes with Arabic translation. I thought it was unique. I think at times it does briefly veer a little bit into propaganda at one point, which I think is to be expected anytime you're reading or watching anything with murder mysteries. But yeah, I thought it was fine. It was interesting, and because there was certainly more to the story than just like a typical vampire detective story, and I ended up rating it 4 stars. And that's it. Those are the first 6 books I read in the month of February. I feel a little bit rusty doing this, so I either was very brief or probably blabbed too much. But yeah, you can stay tuned for the next video where I will discuss the remaining 5 books I read in February. And yeah, please let me know in the comments below if you have read any of these books, or if you want to, or if you have any similar books that you would recommend to the ones I have listed. And yeah, please give this a thumbs up, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.